Well, next on my pocket program, which I hope you're using, right, is dear friend Alan Park, who's going to deliver a helicopter speech. And I suspect he's going to speak about Scotch whisky.
A little bit.
Is it?
A little bit.
Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome to the wonderful country of Scotland. It's a real pleasure to speak in my home country. I was, however, shocked when Fernando put out a promotional video on tequila in the home country of Scotch whisky. I'm going to get him back for that in either Mexico City or Guadalajara at some point. Now, just before I get into it, the image before this was of Edinburgh Castle, and the theme today is strength from the spirit of Scotland. So what we're really going to go through is what does Scotch whisky and the industry do in terms of its contribution to the UK globally and that wider fight supporting GIs around the world. So our strength comes from its heritage. It comes from its economic contribution and export success. It comes as a strong GI contributing greatly to the development of GI law around the world, and of course its strength through the issues around Brexit. So if we look at just the heritage, and I'll go back to, oh dear, Edinburgh Castle has gone. If we look at strength through heritage, not too far from here is of course Edinburgh Castle. And it's been continuously occupied for around 2,000 years. And Scotland itself is regarded as one of the oldest kingdoms in Europe, with its current borders settled more than 1,000 years ago at the Great Battle of Carham, where we once again defeated the English. But Scotch whisky also has an ancient lineage, and whisky having been produced in Scotland for centuries. The oldest reference to whisky occurs in the Scottish Exchequer Rolls of 1494, where, as you see, there's an entry of 8 balls of malt to Friar John Corr, wherewith to mack or make aqua vitae. And it's been calculated that that would have produced the equivalent of more than 1,500 bottles of whisky. Now, what's interesting there is that he was producing it for the royal court only. And I mean, there might have been a few hangers-on at the Royal Court, but that's a lot of whisky. But Scotch whisky was only being produced then for local consumption, and it wasn't until in the 19th century that a number of favourable conditions came together to create a huge increase in production and wider awareness of Scotch whisky. And that all started when King George IV visited Scotland. And as one contemporary put it, the Chamberlain was looking everywhere for pure Glenlivet whisky. The king drank nothing else. So for those who have an issue with us tackling Glenbuchenbach in Germany, I just want to remind everyone that Glenlivet from the 19th century was well known to the British Royal Court and was being exported around the world before the end of the 19th century. We are, of course, in talking about Glenlivet, talking about single malt whisky, and the traditional Highland pot still, which is on the image on the screen, has not changed in centuries, and it still produces the spirit we recognise today as single malt Scotch whisky. So, a position of great strength in its heritage, authenticity and provenance that we clearly share with many GIs in the EU and around the world. And it's that we're trying to protect ultimately. It is not just the profit that comes from selling a great product, but it's the jobs that are principally residing in rural areas. In Scotland, it's Speyside and the Highlands, where most of the distilleries are located, where those high-quality jobs of coopers and still makers and still men and women are producing this great product and gaining high-quality jobs essentially for life. Think also of Darjeeling Hill Country for rural jobs, and I think Francis Fay from the European Commission was speaking earlier about that importance of rural development. But it's not just in developing countries, it's the rural economy in developed countries as well. But let's consider moving on to the strength of Scotch whisky's economic contribution. That is the figure for 2017, 39 bottles of Scotch whisky exported from the UK every second. In 2018, it became 41 bottles a second. So we are clearly an export icon for the United Kingdom, and we'll run through some of those statistics. So let's put it in that wider perspective. We are more than 20% of all UK food and drink exports. That's gin, that's beer, that's beef, that's fish, that's the works. We are around 80% of all of Scotland's food and drink exports. And again, the largest net contributor, one of the UK's balance of trade in goods. If it was not for Scotch whisky, the UK's trade deficit, which is considerable, would be 3% worse. So when you look at this through the prism of Brexit, you see how important we are to the mix of exports going forward. 40,000 jobs in the industry and supply chain across the UK, 5 billion in value to the UK economy, and we had the most visitor numbers to our distilleries in 2018 at upwards of 2 million, and that is just going to increase as that interest and new distilleries open with their new distillery centres. We have now 128 whisky distilleries, and there are about 20 in the pipeline in production, and we would expect most of them to come through in the next 10 years. Looking at it a bit more globally, Scotch whisky makes up about 1/3 of the export mix. It's fairly stable. It's a mature market, obviously, but clearly a crucial one. But the future, in many ways, is in those developing countries where great growth potential can exist. So we don't want to see the UK do a trade deal with the United States. We would much rather see the UK do a trade deal with a country like Nigeria or India or Brazil, where there is so much more potential for the UK food and drink world, particularly for Scotch whisky, because Scotch whisky is truly global. We are sold in every market where it's legal and somewhere it's not, no names being mentioned. But the developing markets and the rising middle classes in Africa and Asia for luxury goods is where we need to target our resources for the future. Interesting stat, never quite got to the bottom of this one. In wintertime, there are 200 people on Antarctica, and in summertime, upwards of 2,000. So let's take summertime. So that's 15 bottles for 15,000 bottles, so spreading around 2,000 people, not all of whom may like Scotch whisky. So it's an interesting statistic, and I'm looking forward to updated figures and where that whisky is going in Antarctica. Hopefully not for the penguins. I do enjoy this one, and I'm in my home country, so please indulge me where I criticise every other whisky category. But we outsell US, Canadian, Irish, and I can throw in Japanese whisky as well, combined. So as the big person on the block, everyone wants to knock us off that pedestal, and they're doing their best, which is why it's just as important for us to continue to promote and protect our Scotch whisky GI around the world. We are the big counterfeit target, and we have to stay ahead of the game. And for any French members in the audience, I want to also say that we sell more Scotch whisky in France in 1 month than cognac is sold in France all year. I do enjoy that one as well. But again, you have to indulge me because I'm in Edinburgh and no one can lynch me here. Let's talk a bit about our strength as a geographical indication. Now, clearly, Scotch whisky is a GI, and it's been a GI before the concept was introduced by TRIPS, as we can see from the Royal Commission report of 1909 into what was Scotch whisky at that time. And what's interesting when you look at this very detailed Royal Commission report going back more than 100 years is it concluded Scotch whisky was whisky made in a certain way, distilled in Scotland, and that effectively is the basis in which the definition of Scotch whisky rested for the next 100 years. And we think it illustrates the very simple principle upon which the concept of a GI is based, namely that the goods have a reputation tied to a particular geographical area. And of course, you'll see also the other finding of the Commission that certain other geographic indications, such as Highland, Lowland, Campbelltown, were recognised trade descriptions denoting distinct classes of Scotch whisky and the parts of Scotland in which they are distilled. And in reaching this conclusion, the Royal Commission, as far back as then, was anticipating that other important GI principle, namely there should be a link between the characteristics of the product and its place of manufacture. However, the UK's approach as a whole to geographical indications over the years has been entirely ambivalent. The original parties to the Lisbon Agreement did not include the UK, and they were principally other European countries strongly bought into appellations of origin. And when that agreement was drawn up, the UK view was that to confer a monopoly on the use of particular names was in some way anti-competitive. Why shouldn't a cheesemaker in Scotland make Stilton? If makers of Stilton think that's wrong, then it's up to them to do something about it rather than the government. And other countries in the New World have sympathised with that British approach over the years, and nothing illustrates that more graphically than the list of wine names which were listed by Canada in its trademark legislation as legitimate names for Canadian wines. And the Brits in the audience may remember the adverts for QC British Sherry. And never mind Amontillado Sherry. Can I tempt you to an Armadillo Sherry from Britain? Now, the tide turned against this UK approach in the 1980s, and Scotch whisky was at the heart of this when it became an EU geographical designation in the first Spirit Drinks Regulation of 1989. And needless to say, British sherry became British fortified wine and then disappeared without trace. But regardless of that changing landscape, the SWA has been taking action to protect Scotch whisky in courts across the world since at least the 1950s. I'm one of 5 lawyers and a paralegal. At any one time, we have up to 60 cases in courts around the world, hundreds of investigations, any one of which can turn into those legal proceedings, and around 800 trademark objections. Those trademark objections are designed as a preemptive strike against anyone attempting to register a mark which could suggest an origin in Scotland when used on whisky. So when it comes back to that evocation debate that was had here earlier, we are a preemptive evocation strike, if you like, on anyone trying to register Edinburgh Castle for Russian whisky or tartan on the image of a Class 33 product that could be whisky of another origin. So we've been vociferous in our unfair competition rights for many, many decades now, and we have to practice zero tolerance. It does not matter that the market is relatively small. India was tiny for Scotch whisky in the 1950s, but we were there litigating to ensure that Scottish indications of origin were not being misused on locally produced whisky, and now the market is one of our top 10. But establishing our rights is not always easy, and we have to use a mix of different remedies and whatever's available. So because we've been doing this for a long time, we have now 30 countries around the world where Scotch whisky is specifically defined in domestic law. For example, that's a quote from the US Federal Code, which is really just as good in terms of GI status if you can get into domestic legislation in the country concerned. We're registered as a GI or a collective or certification trademark in more than 100 markets now. But where that is not possible, we are protected obviously under general laws, and no court has refused to recognise Scotch whisky as meaning whisky from Scotland. So unlike perhaps our friends in Cognac and elsewhere, we have managed to hold the line and we are nowhere generic anywhere in the world, and that will continue, Brexit regardless. But let's look at this in practice. What is great about GI status compared to any other status? These are 3 examples of products that we picked up fairly recently on sale in India. Now, some of them contain maybe a small amount of Scotch whisky, but you'll see the prominence being given to Scotch in one of them, the only reference to the ingredient in Blue Patrol is Scotch whisky, and the other one, again, a very prominent reference to Scotch whisky, despite the fact none of them are Scotch whiskies. If we were litigating prior to our GI registration in India against those products, we could probably kiss goodbye to conclusion of the case at the Supreme Court for 30 years. We do have legal proceedings ongoing in India from the 1980s, which are still live, hoping for that interim injunction to become permanent at some time soon. But with GI status in India, the worm has turned dramatically. We took court action, High Court in Delhi, against all 3 products from different companies at the same time, and within 6 months, these were removed from sale. GI status is the gold standard for taking action against counterfeit or unfair competition misuse issues. So, when comparing to other forms of protection, we have had to argue with the UK government on what is the best form of protection post-Brexit. Although we've had some discussions earlier on sessions about Brexit and GIs in the UK going forward, and we've got to a good place, but that was not an easy fight at the early stage. There was a lot of uncertainty and knowledge around what GIs really are, and still that is the case in some government departments to this day. And we've been trying to change and inform that. Until now, the EU has picked up the heavy load for GIs, and the UK did not need to take a particularly strong interest outside our friends in DEFRA. However, GI protection, gold standard though it may be in the EU, is far from perfect. So I certainly agree with Francis's comments earlier, where he said that we have that strong protection. We do. The concepts and the theory is strong, but the inconsistency across EU member states in terms of that implementation, whether through the courts or whether a complaint to the enforcement agencies, is simply not good enough. Why should I be able to sweep up fake Scotch whisky more quickly with criminal proceedings in Tunisia within 6 months than the 8 years it took to remove a fairly simple fake Scotch whisky problem in Austria? I do not know. My problem, I think, is that process is now winning over substance, and it's simply not good enough to rest on the laurels of what is theoretically excellent. We have to go back to TRIPS to remember that evocation is all about the use of any means which indicates or suggests that good. That's not a difficult concept. This conceptual proximity that the CGEU talks about must be the use of any means which indicates or suggests the GI. Take out the misleading bit of WTO TRIPS, and you have essentially where evocation is supposed to come from in simple English language. However, the GI system in Europe is clearly the best in the world from that point of view. Contrary views around the world are very surprising. It is not the intent that the Food Standards Code in Australia ensures that what is sold in Australia under a GI is the same as that sold to consumers in the country indicated by the GI. So the same brand of Scotch whisky sold in Edinburgh can be different in Australia. We think not. That's not a GI. And yet that is the view from the Australian enforcement authorities under their law. IP rights are private rights. The protection of GIs in Australia falls to those who enjoy their commercial benefits. That goes back to the UK common law view of the 1980s that, hey, it's for you guys to protect your rights. It's not for enforcement authorities to get their hands dirty when it's your problem. These are your rights. Well, that's wrong when it comes to GIs, because GIs at that high quality end, at that reputational end, are, if sold in large quantities fraudulently, are misleading consumers left, right and centre. It's not good enough for enforcement authorities in nations which look at GIs through a trademark prism to say these are private rights, these aren't community GI rights that we should be enforcing. Now, when we look at across the world, we have to accept that not everyone buys into GI, so we'll take whatever system is available to sweep the problems away, and we've become very good at it over the years. So the one on the left, and there's tartan in the front here, so it's no surprise that tartan figures heavily in those who wish to fake Scotch whisky. The one on the left was on sale in Armenia, and before we stopped that, in the Armenian courts, 50,000 bottles had been exported to Russia. And the damage of that isn't just one sale to one fraud. It is the damage to reputation which goes beyond that, from word of mouth and people saying, I tried this Mac House Scotch whisky and it was rotten. I'm not going to try Scotch whisky again. And it's clearly it was not a 12-year-old product. But we had to use unfair competition laws for Mac House, no GI, no trademark protection, but it was efficient and it was effective, and it's Armenia. Royal Douglas was on sale in South Africa. It's clearly described as a product of South Africa. It doesn't even say whisky on it, but there's tartan, there's a Scottish name, Royal Douglas. We argued under the South African law of passing off that that was not acceptable, and the High Court in Johannesburg agreed with us. Glendundee on the right was a sale in Spain, and again, for those who still have their doubts on Glen Buchenbach, there's no surprise that people choose Glen to stick on fake Scotch whisky, because they know when used on whisky, it's associated with Scotch whisky. In that case, we tackled it under EU GI laws very effectively. But that's all the day job. Then came Brexit. So, for Brexit, we're coming, to some extent, full circle with the problems that we had back in Britain in the 1980s, because I was listening to what people were saying earlier about how the post-Brexit landscape will look. But there's still a battle to be fought there. And those with strong GI interests who are worried about EU GIs getting continued protection post-Brexit, the fight is still there. Different government departments have different views on that. We are the strongest supporter that our European colleagues has in the UK to push the fact that UK consumers deserve to have EU GI status continued post-Brexit, regardless of the politics, that it's not acceptable for cognac and champagne and Parma ham and so on for their protection to fall out or to get weaker protection under the laws of passing off simply because of politics. So we have put that message to as high as the Prime Minister, and although we have a UK GI register going forward, which is great, the EU GIs getting that continued protection in the UK post-Brexit is a battle still to be won. What Prime Minister are we going to have? Will there be a general election? Is there going to be a referendum? Will there be no deal? All of these will have an impact on what has become a very political issue from 2 years ago, when no one in half the UK government departments even knew what a GI was. But with many thousands of GIs at stake for the EU and for the 86 UK ones wanting to expand awareness of GIs through the UK and beyond into the wider world, where our friends in Europe will be, we will always be a strong supporter. We need to change the dynamic quite a bit. If the UK does a deal with the US, there is a risk that it's all to do with, well, maybe you could just protect that by way of a trademark rather than GI status, and that is something we do not agree with. Our immediate Brexit challenges, however, were goods to market. We're excisable goods, so that's a problem. We need warehouses, we need special certification and movement certificates to move around the EU, within the EU as well. That's going to be a problem on a no deal. We're working hard on that. We wanted all EU laws relevant to the industry and beyond for food and drink rolled into the UK. That's a win under the withdrawal deal. We want a GI framework in the UK. That was a win under the withdrawal deal. We do want all agreements between the EU and third countries rolled over to the UK. And it's not just about trade deals. There are many dozens of agreements which only deal with wine and spirit protection that we want to see rolled over as well. So we've been doing this since the day one in 2016, and we will continue to do it until there is no chance of return, whether it's no deal, whether it's a withdrawal agreement and a future trade agreement. But we've been in it from the beginning with all relevant government departments, and we will continue that strong fight. However, there are Brexit opportunities as well that we have to recognise. The new trade deals. We want to see trade deals with those developing economies. The UK is the 5th largest economy in the world. There is no reason it can't do punchy trade deals with many markets in which the EU has not yet been able to. For example, in India, that would be a game changer for us. The tax on Scotch whisky, the tax on all spirits, imported spirits going into India is 150%. If that goes down significantly as a trade deal, the amount of Scotch whisky, for example, that could be traded in India would be up significantly. The EU emissions trading scheme is problematic for the industry. Our bottling halls are not allowed to be part of it. They should be. Fairer taxation, we are discriminated against in our domestic market vis-à-vis wines and beers. The taxation system is based on some 18th century notion of how spirits are compared to wines and beers, and we want to see that duty equalisation programme rolled out across all alcohol, regardless of the type of alcohol per unit of alcohol. That's a hard fight, but it might be easier out with the EU Excise Structures Directive. Duty-free, that will be an opportunity we have to consider as if the UK, as and when the UK leaves the European Union. And of course, the new agricultural policy will change the dynamics of the cereals and crops that we need for Scotch whisky production. But one big thing that we would want to see, and that depends on how GIs work out post-Brexit, is that promotion work for UK food and drink products around the world and upskilling the UK embassy network to pick up the slack from where we got great support from EU delegations around the world on IP protection. Looking forward, we have issues around better understanding and enforcement. The caseload is becoming significantly more challenging, and litigation is slow and expensive. So how do we better share experiences over how to tackle problems in individual markets? Is it civil or criminal proceedings? Are they private or public? Which enforcement authorities? Administrative complaints. In Australia, we have to take civil proceedings to take any real action. In Tunisia and China, administrative complaints are extremely effective. And in France, criminal proceedings with the rights holder as a partie civile can work just as well as other forms of protection. So, all that said, we will continue with the day job against Castle Glen from Australia, from Grants Regal from Turkey, and the wider Middle East, Scottish swordsmen from Italy, the Clan Scott from Germany, and Stirling Scotch whisky from Thailand. All have been removed. We will continue with that work, and we'll continue to promote GIs around the world and domestically. Thank you for listening. I'm very happy to take questions, although I can't quite see the audience very clearly here. Oh, yeah, yes.
My name is François Grismar from Siglex France. I noted that you protect whiskey, Scotch whisky by collective trademarks when GIs are not accessible. Could you briefly say what are the downsides of collective trademark protection? Because you often hear the United States explaining that GIs are useless, bad, whatever, and the trademarks is quite sufficient.
Well, firstly, GIs are clearly the gold standard compared to certification or collective trademarks. Collective trademarks, we can only register as a collective trademark in those regimes that allow collective trademarks to be registered by organisations that don't represent the whole collective, which for some regimes you have to. So in China, we have a collective trademark because although the Scotch Whisky Association represents only 95% of Scotch whisky production, we can still get a collective trademark in China. But in other regimes, we cannot because we do not represent 100% of production. And we don't represent 100% of production because we're a voluntary private trade association, so it's not mandatory to join, unlike that tequila mob in the room somewhere. Hello, Fernando. Or cognac and champagne, which are really semi-government organisations. So as a private trade association, we have challenges. Certification trademark, in some countries, you require to show that you, the trade association, certify the goods. We do not. The UK government certifies Scotch whisky by certificates of age and origin and a verification scheme. So in some countries where there's flexibility for certification trademarks, we can say, well, we're partnered with the UK government who certify the goods, and sometimes that works. It did for Australia when we got our certification trademark there, but it doesn't in other jurisdictions.
And I would say in addition that if there are misuse of the term Scotch whisky for things other than spirits, then trademarks are not a very good tool to fight.
Well, they're not, simply because the depth and breadth of protection by comparison is nowhere near as good, and you never get any help from the enforcement authorities for trademark rights, in our experience. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.